Hey guys, welcome to Unit 9, Human Development or the Lifespan. Make sure you have something to take notes with and that you come to class with at least one question. Also, throughout the PowerPoint, you're going to see that there are some links that you can click to that give you more information about the topic. Usually they are short little videos, like a minute and a minute and a half, that will just give you some really good information about it, or in some cases even review some of the things that we have already talked about in AP Psych. Here are the unit objectives. We are focusing in this video on describing the physical development of infants and children from conception to puberty. Developmental psychology is the most comprehensive topic in psychology. A developmental psychologist look at how our behavior and our thoughts change over time. They really look at twin studies because they're useful in determining the similarities and then developmental differences as well. We are looking at that bigger question in this unit of nature versus nurture. What are we born with versus what does the environment, how does it change our behavior? Studies conducted in this field are either usually cross-sectional or longitudinal, which we have looked at those before. But cross-sectional, as a reminder, is when participants of differing ages compare variable change over time. So cross-sectional research can be done pretty quickly, but they lack that ability to recognize historical or cultural influences. So you can get fast data, but you don't know how necessarily the people got to that point in their developmental stages. And then you have longitudinal studies where you're looking at one group of participants over a long period of time, which you may have some really hard, concrete evidence at the end, but it takes a really long time to get there. When we first look into human development, we have to first look at the patterns. In human development, researchers look at two opposing views, continuity versus discontinuity. Continuity is just that development is gradual and it is continuous, while discontinuity is that development proceeds in an uneven fashion, that it's abrupt, that life happens as a succession of changes that we kind of progress into. You can argue probably either side, but I will say that most psychologists today prescribe to that discontinuity theory, that development happens in stages. Prenatal development, people used to think humans were born with a blank slate. Remember John Locke from your history classes, the idea of tabula rasa. That as we grew, we acquired abilities and brain power. Today we think that's inaccurate, that babies are born with innate abilities, and we'll actually talk about some of those abilities in a minute. That they were born with abilities that allow for survival, and that humans grow, the abilities become more complex. We've looked at language acquisition before. Chomsky was nature. Remember the idea that we had a box inside our head, and as we developed, language started to slowly kind of creep out of that language box. But then you also have B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning and the idea that it's our environment that it's influencing our language acquisition. The language acquisition device, or the nativist theory, is more of that Chomsky idea that the ability to learn language rapidly as a child reflects the innate capacity of the brain to understand language, that babies have grammar skills even before they're born. And again, we have them, we just don't unlock them until we develop. And then you have the linguistic relativity hypothesis, which is Sapir-Whorf, or we talked about Benjamin Whorf, that the language we use might control and in some ways limit our thinking. That, for example, the effect of labeling how we think about people or objects or ideas changes the way that we think about that person, object, or idea. And thereby the language we use actually limits us, that we label people, and then once we get that label in our head, we are limited about thinking about them. That you put, my teachers go here, and when you see your teachers at Walmart, it brings up a whole other set of issues for you. How many ways does the English language express, like snow, for example? I mean, here we say it's snowing, and even when it doesn't maybe meet the criteria of snow, we still say snow because we don't have any other words for it necessarily. But in the Inuit culture, there are over 50 ways to say snow because they're in Alaska and there's a lot of snow. The same thing can be applied for maybe like hot. So the same thing can kind of be applied for hot in the South, for example. We have a lot of different ways to say hot or I'm hot. And so we say what we are familiar with. Babies learn to talk within the first 2 years of life. So between 18 months and 2 years, the baby will begin to develop one-word and two-word sentence structures. We've talked about phonemes and morphemes before, and we also talked about overgeneralization or over-regularization, which is misapplication of grammar rules. So for example, with kids, a lot of times they'll say something like, Marky hitted my head, so I throwed a truck at him. You understand what he is saying, even though it's not necessarily grammatically correct. We've also looked at syntax and prototypes as well. The prenatal period spans 9 months between conception and birth. This period undergoes extensive development, readying the being for life. Shortly after conception, you have a fertilized egg, which the term for that is a zygote. It begins cell division until it reaches 150 divisions. The zygote is then going to attach itself to the uterine wall where it becomes an embryo, and that usually starts to happen between 6 days and completes the process at about 10 days after conception. So here you have a single sperm cell, which is male, penetrating the outer coating of the egg, the female, and it fuses to form that one fertilized egg, or the zygote. And you can see again here the idea of the egg being fertilized, then it dividing up, and the first division happens at about 30 hours. And then you can start to see the zygote phase, and at the very end you see the implementation beginning at about 6 days. A zygote is a fertilized egg with 100 cells that become increasingly diverse. At about 14 days, the zygote turns into an embryo. So right here on the left-hand side, you have your zygote, and then on the right side is the embryo. During the embryonic stage, the genetic plan is mapped out, and the embryo cells begin to specialize or differentiate themselves into various components of organs and body systems. And you have what's called embryonic stem cells, which you may have heard in the news about stem cell research, and we'll look at that in class. But it's cells that are capable of forming into any organ of the body and exist prior to differentiation. Cells form specific layers, so the outer layer cells become the nervous system and skin. Those middle layer cells are going to become muscles, bones, blood vessels, internal organs. Inner layer cells become a path of digestion and lung development and glands. At about 3 weeks, you have a heartbeat and become reflexive a few weeks later to stimulation. So if it's stimulated, it'll be faster, slower, depending on what the stimulation is. This happens a long time before the brain can think about or direct any behaviors. And then at about 8 weeks, you have the embryo becomes a fetus, where a somatic nervous system begins to show spontaneous movement in the fetus. And we're going to kind of have that discussion in class about where is life actually life? Like, is it a zygote? Is it an embryo? Is it a fetus? Where along the spectrum, where do you call that life? The placenta, which I know this picture is small, but if you can see down here, is right here. It serves as the organ interface between mother and fetus, and it controls the exchange of nutrients and waste products. It's very, very nutrient rich. And in some cultures, the mothers eat the placenta after the baby has been born, because it is very, very rich in nutrients. And you can actually save the placenta if you would like. At 9 weeks, an embryo turns into a fetus. And you can see here just kind of those weeks of conception, what the baby starts to look like. You have what's called teratogens. Teratogens are chemicals that if you ingest them, they can cause harm to the baby. You ingest a lot of these, but the placenta usually filters out most of the harmful chemicals. Probably the most dangerous and the most common one is alcohol. Any amount of alcohol can cause what we call fetal alcohol syndrome, or fetal alcohol effect. You see up here in the corner, this is what a child that has fetal alcohol syndrome, some of the symptoms. They have underdeveloped jaws, their heads are usually smaller, a very thin upper lip, a very flat space between their nose and their lip, and a very short nose, small eye openings. The most common, like I said, teratogen is alcohol. However, you also have other ones like nicotine, so smoking, and secondhand smoking is also teratogens. Drugs, crack, meth, heroin, HIV and AIDS can all penetrate the placenta and cause developmental delays, birth defects in the child. Also, different drugs. A lot of antidepressants you can't take the antidepressant when you are pregnant because, again, it penetrates the placenta. Accutane that people take for acne problems is also another teratogen. The brain grows at an amazing rate. 250,000 new neurons per minute. By birth, your brain has upwards of 100 billion. And the neural tube is going to send out all of these new neurons to form infinite amount of connections throughout the rest of the brain. When babies first enter the world after that prenatal period, they take in all of this information. And so you have where they exhibit a set of reflexes that are inborn. All of these are automatic. So things like a rooting reflex. When you touch a baby on the cheek, they're going to turn its head towards the side where it was touched. And they're going to try to put it in their mouth. They're going to try to suck on it. Both the rooting reflex and the sucking reflex are for survival because, again, you need that to suck on a bottle or a nipple or however you are feeding the baby. The grasping reflex, whatever you put in the baby's hand, they're going to try to grasp it. You also have the Moro reflex. When a startled baby, they're going to fling out their extremities and then very quickly retract them and try to make themselves as small as possible. So they usually, with that Moro reflex, they'll like arch their back and then it'll come down very quickly and flat and they'll cram everything in. And then you have the Babitsky reflex, is when you stroke the baby's foot, they spread out their toes. Babies are also born with a lot of sensory systems in place. Babies can hear before the birth. They hear their mother's voice and the voices that are around them while they're in womb. Babies also have the same basic taste and smell preferences as adults. Babies, the vision is very weak. Let me show you on this next page. You can see the idea of like what a baby sees from newborn to 6 months. So they rely very heavily on that sense of hearing until their sense of vision gets better. You also have motor skills that they vary from person to person, which is myelinated, which means that most of the babies are going to be able to do this at the time. And I will say, when you go to the pediatrician, they'll ask, can your baby do this, based on like what month they are, how many words can they say, can they roll over, can they catch a ball, those kind of things. You can see here that first infants are going to begin to roll over, next they sit unsupported, crawl, and then finally walk. And experience has little effect on this. You can try to get your baby to do these things, but until they're actually physically and mentally ready, they're not going to be able to do them. And again, you can see here some of what babies are supposed to be able to do when. During the infancy period, nerve circuits are developing. They cause the inability for us to remember events early in life. So most of our memories, remember that we don't remember very much before the age of 3.5. In this period, the brain circuitry is transitioning from producing cells to starting to make those neural connections, those pathways, the branching of the axons and the dendrites. This is limited due to physical size of the brain. And you can see here what those neural connections start to really look like at birth, at 3 months, and then at 15 months. You also have maturation, physical maturation. We've talked about what happens in adolescence. So the process is by which the genetic program manifests itself over time. One of the first signs of puberty is our growth spurt. So adolescents begin puberty, which is sexual maturation. It begins earlier in females, about 11 years old, and then in males at about 13 years old. And the height in females increases before males. So you end up with a lot of very tall females, a lot of short males. During puberty, you have primary sexual characteristics, like your reproductive organs, your external genitalia. All of those develop rapidly. So you can start to see here that you also have secondary sexual characteristics, which are the non-reproductive traits, such as breasts, hips in girls, facial hair, the deepening of voice in boys, pubic hair, and armpit hair growth in both sexes. And again, you see here some of that development. These are all, for the most part, secondary sexual characteristics. We'll talk more about this when we get to adolescence, because a lot of this is more about mental development. But body image development, girls often feel inadequate about their body shape. Boys often sometimes feel they need to show physical strength, athleticism. And together these influence our perception of ourselves, and our social and cultural cues really make us think about how we look at ourselves. So So that's all for about the first objective, and make sure that you have taken notes. Thanks.